Thanks for that, Mary. I presume everyone can hear me. So, good evening, everyone, on this lovely evening, and Tralee Workhouse Burial Ground. So, famine, death, burial, not very cheery topics for a November evening in the middle of a pandemic, unless you see them as light relief, from the US election. But they are, I guess, appropriate topics for the time of year, with yesterday being All Souls Day, which is a time when we remember the dead. So before I go any further, I'd like to remember someone who died in October, Dr. Margaret McCurtain, who was a very good friend of mine, but who was also a great friend and supporter of this society. I got to know her first when I was a student in UCD. And I consider myself very, very lucky that I had her in my life for the last 35 years. This is Margaret on a trip to the Jeanie Johnston shipyard, I think in 1999. So really, I'd just like to dedicate this talk to her memory. Okay, onwards to Tralee Workhouse Burial Ground. So the first thing I guess to do is to locate it for those who are unfamiliar with it. So it's marked there in blue at the back of Kerry County Council's campus in Rathas in Tralee. So as many of you know, before Kerry County Council, the building here was St. Catherine's Hospital. That's it there, I think probably from the 1960s. And before that, it was the workhouse, which opened in 1844. So just to point out, the talk this evening isn't a history of the workhouse, nor is it a history of the famine. The focus primarily here is on the dead of the workhouse. So first of all, I'm going to trace the development of the burial ground. And really, I guess I should use the plural in this sense because there was more than one, as we'll see. Then I'll deal with who was being buried, like who are the dead. And I'll deal with how many are buried and where, as well as how they are buried. So I'm sticking pretty much to the famine period of the 1840s and the 50s, but I'll also look at what happened to these burial grounds afterwards. And finally, I'll talk about how we might remember the dead who are buried there. Now, it might sound as if I've answers to all these questions, but really, there's still so much we don't know about these graves, and this piece of research has been like pulling a thread that has yet to unravel fully. So this is the workhouse from the first edition Ordnance Survey map in just before the famine. So the Board of Guardians in Tralee first began discussing burial ground for the workhouse dead in February 1845, a year after the house opened. Initially, they thought about purchasing a small piece of ground near the existing graveyard in Rathas, but they'd keep it separate from the main graveyard. But that was going to mean negotiating with Morris Quill, which, experience had taught them was not for the faint-hearted, because you see, the ground on which the workhouse stood was ultimately, the ultimate owner was James O'Connell, brother of Daniel, but the main lessee, the immediate lessee was, was Morris Quill, who in turn was renting it to the Board of Guardians. And from the word go, there'd been trouble with Quill over many things, the siting of the workhouse, the boundary wall, the payment of rent. There was very difficult relationship with him. So the Guardians were kind of wary of tangling with him. And he was also Quill was also the immediate lessor of the land between the workhouse and the graveyard. I've marked it out there in green. And it was this piece of ground that the Guardians were thinking of for their own graveyard. But one of them sort of pointed out at a meeting that it wouldn't be easy to purchase it from Mr. Quill, as he's in the habit of getting heavy sums for graves in the church, and in proportion, the price he would set on a piece of ground near it must be very high. Now, this kind of rather cryptic comment had me very puzzled for a while, but excuse me, what it means will become clearer in a few minutes. In the meantime, the Poor Law commissioners, who are the overlords, let's say, of the Board of Guardians, suggested that what they could do was do what other places had done, which was to enclose a portion of the workhouse grounds as a cemetery. And the Guardians decided to do that once the workhouse walls were built. Now, it took a year for the walls to be built because there was the inevitable wrangling with Quill over the boundaries. But eventually, in April 46, they selected a corner in the northeast of the workhouse site. I've just outlined it there in blue. and this was going to be the burial place. So up to that point, between 1844 and when it opened and up to March 1846, we know from returns submitted to the Poor Law Commissioners that 129 people had died in Tralee Workhouse. But where they're buried, where they are buried isn't clear, but that might become clear a little earlier on, or sorry, a little later on. Now, it was possible for families to claim their dead. I mean, the burial ground of the workhouse was for the unclaimed dead of the workhouse. And I think this is probably likely to have happened before the famine, and probably after the famine as well, when things were more settled. But you know, I think a certain percentage of cases were claimed by their families. But I think during the famine, I think that would probably have been the exception rather than the rule. So the new burial ground was consecrated by Bishop Egan at the end of May 1846. And very quickly afterwards, obviously, the famine began to make its presence felt. And so it's hardly surprising that less than a year later, in April 1847, the workhouse medical officer, Dr. Alton, was complaining that there was no longer sufficient room for burials in the cemetery. And at this stage, by the summer of 1847, I mean, every workhouse in the country was full and people were dying left, right and centre. And so the Poor Law Commissioners started instructing the boards of guardians around the country to close any burial site within that they had on their own premises, and to establish cemeteries outside, away from the workhouse, and away from the towns, and also that each grave should be 5 feet deep. But in Tralee, and I think in a lot of other places as well, nothing seems to have been done at this stage, because there was just so much going on, and they didn't seem to have gotten another graveyard for the workhouse then, and the burials continued in the plot at the back of the house. By May 1849, the situation was just beyond desperate, because a cholera pandemic had hit Ireland that year, and it just wreaked havoc on the population that was already weakened by the famine. Like, for instance, in one day alone, on the 8th of May, 10 people died of, in one day, 10 people died of cholera just in Tralee Workhouse. That's not in the town itself. And in just 1 week, the week ending the 19th of May, 99 people died in the workhouse. That's not in the town itself. So the bodies were piling up, and the Board of Guardians were absolutely desperate to find more ground for burials. Now, in May 1849, our old friend Maurice Quill offered them an acre of ground adjoining the workhouse for about £110, but this was too much money. As a result, the Board of Guardians decided, they started advertising, the first of many ads, for a piece of land that they could use, that they purchase or lease, that would be within 2 miles of the workhouse. So that seemed to have worked pretty quickly too, because in the middle of June, they announced that they were taking a spacious burial ground just adjoining the old graveyard at Rathas at a yearly rent of £10. So this new burial ground, they said, was for the use of the workhouse dead, the several charitable institutions, kind of like the relief committees, and the county prison. The Guardians had great plans for the piece of ground. They said it's proposed to erect a neat-looking gravedigger's cottage at the end of the plot of land adjoining the road, and to make some gravel walks around the ground, and to plant some trees so as to give the place a decent and reverent appearance. So that sounds great. So that summer of 1849, they started to bury people here. Now, the cholera epidemic had receded at this stage, so the number of deaths had gone down. So the numbers that were being buried there were not very high. But very soon after they planted the first burials in that piece of ground, they were served a notice to desist by the existing occupier of the land, someone they knew nothing about. So the thing was that the deal they had done was, of course, with Maurice Quill. Nothing came easy with Maurice Quill. He was also the immediate lessor of the ground, let's say, on the town side of Rathas, 14 acres of which he had sublet to a man called Edward Slattery. And this neat new graveyard was to be somewhere here on almost 3 acres. So the Guardians stopped the burials, thinking, they were desperate at this stage, and presumably out of desperation, we must assume, they entered into an alternative arrangement with Quill for some ground on his land between the workhouse and Rathas. that smaller plot of ground there, outlined in green. So Quill had an existing tenant on this ground as well, a man called John Healy, but John Healy doesn't seem to have had a problem with the guardians burying their dead there. And again, this was something that puzzled me. Why did the tenant on one side, on the workhouse side, not have a problem with this, while Edward Slattery, the subtenant on the other side, why was he kicking up over it? So to understand what's going on, I think let's have a look at, this is a map I've outlined. This is the extent of the churchyard, the Rathas church ground, as shown on the first edition map. Now, according to Griffith's valuation, the ground here amounted to 3 roods and 13 perches, which is just a little bit less than an acre. So the existing church, of course, in Rathas is very old, parts of it dating back to the 10th century. But there'd also been an earlier ecclesiastical settlement. That's it there outlined in red. Going back earlier, much earlier, possibly to the 6th or 7th centuries. Now, this would have been surrounded by an enclosure, a bank separating what's outlined in red is the ecclesiastical enclosure, which is a bank separating the monastic settlement from the surrounding area. So you can see that this encompasses a much larger area than the churchyard. You can also see in this one here that it takes in the land that Quill was the immediate lesser of. So now it was likely that some remains of the enclosure's bank were still there in the 19th century, so marking a boundary with the surrounding land. And burials within ecclesiastical enclosures were common enough in Ireland, and this practice was very likely to have happened around Rathas churchyard. I mean, I think the enclosure land would have gone into private hands at some point over the centuries. And if I had to guess as to, we don't know because Griffiths doesn't tell you the ultimate owner, just the immediate lesser, I would put my money on it that it was James O'Connell who was the owner of that ground, brother of Daniel, because he and his brother John owned plenty of land around the town. But even though it might have gone into private hands, the folk memory of the enclosure and the expectation that you would be able to bury your dead there would have gone on, I think. So, because for most people, the ground outside the churchyard would have been, outside, let's say, the purple area there, they would have seen it as a part of the churchyard. They would have seen it as part of that, but Quill knew very well what the boundaries were between the church land and the land he was leasing. So thinking back to that cryptic comment earlier on about Quill in 1845, this one here, he is in the habit of getting heavy sums for graves in the church. It wasn't the churchyard where he was getting money for graves, but in the ground surrounding the churchyard that corresponds to the old ecclesiastical enclosure. Now, I suspect there was a difference as well between who was being buried in the town side of the enclosure and who was being buried on the workhouse side. Back in April 1847, Dr. Alton, as I said, the workhouse medical officer, was complaining that about the insufficient manner of burials in the neighbouring graveyard of Rathas, a field or two from the workhouse, and so situated relative to the house that any effluvia arising from it must be wafted over the building. He went on to say that most of the bodies of those interred among the poor were insufficiently covered with earth. Now, these were the poor of the town, not the workhouse poor, because at this stage, the workhouse, they were still burying within their own walls. But these were the poor of the town who couldn't get into the workhouse or didn't want to get in. And most of them wouldn't have been able to pay for a burial plot. So the burials here would have been unmarked and quite haphazard. And what the Board of Guardians ended up leasing from Quill was a small bit of ground within the enclosure on the workhouse side. So I've marked that with a blue question mark inside the red circle. Somewhere along here, they rented some ground from him. And I think really this is what Quill had been driving them towards from the very beginning, from once this whole thing started. Because here was a different matter from the other side, from the town side. On the town side, he was selling graves to the better off, and it was a lot more lucrative. And they would have been more formal burials here with the graves marked out as well. And the other thing to remember is that in the spring and summer, the early summer of 1849, the cholera pandemic didn't just hit the poor, it cut a swathe right through the middle classes in all the towns as well. So that you know, the better off are dying in their droves in the same way as the poor at this stage. You know, it's important to point out that what Quill was doing wasn't illegal. In fact, I wouldn't say it was even unique. Legislation surrounding the burial grounds didn't really start happening until after 1856, but obviously to our ears, it sounds really, really dodgy. But I think it's reasonable to assume that the guardians had tried to site their neat new graveyard for paupers either inside the enclosure on the town side, which Quill didn't want, or outside the enclosure on the town side, the part that Slattery was occupying and to which he objected. Either way, it didn't happen. It probably was never going to happen, and the guardians were forced to lease the ground adjacent to the workhouse and bury the pauper dead from the workhouse with the poor of the town. So unsurprisingly, this new bit of ground started filling up pretty soon. So bear in mind, they started burying here in August 1849. By May 1850, it was getting really full up, and they're again desperate, thinking they might go back to Quill to get more ground from him. But if they did, it was only within the workhouse side of the enclosure. And as more bodies were buried here, the guardians started to pay a man who was living opposite the graveyard. He was a subtenant of John Healy, who was himself a subtenant of Morris Quill. He was living in a cottage there, so they gave him a bit of money, armed him with a gun and ammunition to shoot the dogs, the wild dogs that were roaming around the graveyard, devouring the corpses that were just piling up. So, as I say, I think he was more than likely a man called Cornelius Hanifin. In October 1850, the guardians advertised yet again for a piece of ground. And unbelievably, in response to this, Quill had the nerve to send them a solicitor's letter accusing them of reneging on their earlier deal, the one for the ground outside on the town side of the enclosure. I mean, relations between him and, I mean, he must have been just taunting them at this stage. So they sent him back a fairly nasty letter saying that, pointing out to him that, as he well knew, he hadn't been in a position to let that ground in the first place. And in the second, they were already paying him exorbitant rent for the ground on which the workhouse stood. This was an ongoing sore topic between them, one that I'm not going to get into here. So now we're in November 1850. The workhouse dead are still piling up in the burial ground at the back, outlined in blue there, and within the enclosure there, just around where the my blue question mark is. And they still haven't found anyone who'd sell or rent them more ground. So, and again, another bit of time went by. February 1851, the Poor Law Inspector, Captain Sparks, was urging on them the necessity to do something about it. In June, Sparks' successor, Samuel Horsley, was telling them at a meeting that he considered it disgraceful to a Christian country the manner in which the bodies of the paupers are interred in the workhouse burying ground. So that spurred them on to another ad in 1851, but again, nothing happened. So things continued as they were until April 1850, when it looked like they'd finally found a solution. James O'Connell had agreed to lease them a plot of ground near the auxiliary workhouse of Ballymullen at a rent of £2 a year. Now, whether this went ahead or not, it's a moot point. 3 months later, they were back yet again, looking for a piece of ground, which suggests that the Ballymullen deal fell through. But then again, it may have been a stopgap to deal with the dead of Ballymullen, and they still needed yet more ground. During that one. Eventually, they finally struck a deal in September 1853 with O'Connell that was to see the burial ground that we now know as God's Acre in Ballybeggan. This was their official workhouse burial ground. And that opened in, as I say, opened for burials in October 1853, 4 years after the Guardians had first started looking for somewhere to bury the bury the workhouse dead. Excuse me. But just as they were concluding this deal in September 1853, a letter appeared in the Evening Mail in London, which created a sensation in its description of the burial practice around Rathas Church. The letter writer signed himself an Irishman, and he got straight to the point in his opening paragraph. Within a quarter of a mile of the corporate town of Tralee, the capital town of Kerry, a sight may be seen which is disgraceful to humanity and a reproach to any people. He went on to describe bones and skulls scattered around, coffins cracked open, decaying corpses clearly visible, including that of a child. He concluded his letter by saying, "It is only in Ireland, and especially around Tralee, that the people won't take the trouble to bury their dead out of their sight." And that brought the wrath of the Church of Ireland Archdeacon Rowan down upon the Board of Guardians, and he practically gate-crashed one of their board meetings, brandishing the offending newspaper at them, basically saying that he'd been at them for the past 3 years to do something about the burial ground that he just described as close adjoining, sorry, I messed that up here, close adjoining to the walls of the poorhouse. He said, you gentlemen have rented a piece of ground from Mr. Quill, which appears to be, but is not, part of the churchyard. This you have overloaded with bodies." He was outraged, he said, that matters have now come to the pass that it has become a public scandal and reproach, a subject of indignant remark in the most influential journal in the empire, reflecting not upon you only, but on Tralee also. Furthermore, he thundered, the clergy of Tralee, who have nothing to do with this graveyard, feel aggrieved by the mode in which it is mentioned in the public prints. And, you know, the Guardians were forced to admit to him that 1,800 people had been buried in this. This is the piece inside the enclosure. 1,800 people had been buried there within 3 years. And one of the Guardians, Thomas Hurley, elaborated on this and was more specific. In a letter he wrote to the Evening Mail defending the Board of Guardians, he said that in that spot had been buried the paupers and a great number of the inhabitants of Tralee. 1,876 poor creatures out of the workhouse alone have been interred from September 1850 up to March 1853. So at this point, we got to ask, who are the dead? And I mean, of the thousands of people who died in Tralee Workhouse during the famine, we've the names of only a very small few. Weekly deaths in the workhouse were listed up until early 1847 with the full names and the causes of death given. But from January 1847, the Guardians were told by the Poor Law Commissioners had sent out a circular saying there was no longer any need to record the names of the people who died in the workhouse. I would imagine they couldn't keep up anyway. There were now just weekly statistics. So we can retrieve the names of some of the dead from 1846 and early 1847 from manuscript sources in Trinity and in the National Library. And Brian McMahon, in his book about the famine in North Kerry and Tralee, has included some of these names from the week ending the 12th of January 1847. You can see here, it's unsurprising, you know, a lot of the diseases, a lot of the things that people died from within the workhouse were unsurprisingly epidemic diseases, and particularly obviously anything to do with dysentery, diarrhea, cholera obviously, and all of that. You'll see there as well, there are quite a good few children. And just coming on from that, I mean, even though we mightn't be able to get some sense of the individuals, we can get a sense of who was being buried generally from the work of the osteoarchaeologist Dr. Linda Lynch, who's analysed the excavated remains from a few workhouse burials. That's in Cashel, Manor Hamilton, Borsokane, Tuam and Kilkenny. And given the high infant mortality rate in Ireland before the famine, Linda thought there would be high numbers of infants in the burials, but this is in the workhouse, but this isn't the case. Because you see, fertility rates dropped during the famine, and so it isn't surprising to find a lack of very young infants. There was a corresponding lack of young adults as well amongst the workhouse dead, and these were the ones who were most likely to have the young infants or the babies. Adults were evenly distributed between female. Highest percentage dead in the workhouse remains that she's excavated were children, and particularly between the ages of about 1 and 12 to 15. She quotes a medical officer in Cork describing the children in the workhouse as the children that went out of life like bubbles bursting on a stream. Now, how many people, this was one of the questions, one of the reasons why I started on this piece of research, was trying to work out how many people were buried in the workhouse burial ground at the back of Kerry County Council. Now, the short answer is that a definitive answer to that question isn't easy, because the records of the Boards of Guardians for Tralee are, excuse me, are incomplete for the famine period. There's a large gap between January 1848 and May 1851. The newspapers can fill in some of the gaps as they reported weekly on the Guardians meetings and give great detail on some of the meetings. However, they don't always give the numbers of weekly deaths, but they do give us some indication as to the scale, and as this table here that I've compiled, I hope you'll be able to see it, from the week ending, an 8-week period in 1851, starting the week ending the 17th of May. So you can see it's even just that 8-week period bears out what Linda was saying. The highest percentage of deaths here are children. The men and women are just about evenly distributed. And we're looking at a weekly death rate of 27 at this point. Now, that the spring and early summer in Ireland were always times of high deaths anyway. A lot of it in the past had been to do with the old potatoes were gone, the new potatoes weren't coming in, people were starving. But it seems that quite a few of the epidemics went around at this time of the year, hardly surprising to us now, given what we've gone through earlier on this year. Excuse me. Anyway, if we turn to the census, we hit the wall of uncertainty that surrounds anything to do with counting the dead of the Irish famine. Whole households died or emigrated, and so no returns were given for them in the 1851 census. So being an institution, you'd think the workhouse returns would be reasonably accurate, but the report in the census of 1851 says to us, we experience a very great difficulty indeed in procuring a perfect return of the deaths in the workhouses, a circumstance which will be understood and appreciated by all who have had any knowledge of the great pressure upon these institutions and their officers during the years of famine and pestilence. But having said that, the census is at least a starting point, and it tells us that 2,971 people died in Tralee Workhouse between its opening in 1844 and 1851. Now, we know, as I said earlier on, that 129 people died in the workhouse before the cemetery at the back was opened. So I'm presuming that those people were buried somewhere within the enclosure, on where the poor of the town ended up being buried. So just to recap, that's 2,971 people who died in the workhouse between June 1844 and March 1851, and they're buried in two sites, at the back of Kerry County Council and within the enclosure in Rathas. But you can't also rule out the possibility that there were many others who died in the auxiliary houses, workhouses that were dotted around the town and outside the town. And some of them were perhaps buried in or near those buildings. I mean, I think this is I think you would have to consider that likelihood in those auxiliary houses that were close to fields, such as the one in, well, it's called Rock Street in the Board of Guardians minutes, but it actually, the site of it was in Pembroke Street, and it was near enough to where Balloonic School was subsequently built, but that was all fields at that stage. Kilhan and Ballard as well is another one I'd have my suspicions about, that there would have been burials there. and possibly also Ballymonaghan. I think during periods of epidemics, I think if they could bury them somewhere else and nobody was the wiser, I think they certainly did. And of course, they aren't counted because it was only in June 1849 that the Boards of Guardians decided to have just one register of paupers that would include all of the auxiliary establishments. So prior to this, that's between 1847 and 1849. Were there records kept in the auxiliary houses? The answer is we don't know. Are deaths of those houses recorded in that period? Or we don't know. Were they brought to the main workhouse for burial? We don't know. But I think it has to be unlikely given that how crowded the burial grounds were there. Now, I do have some reports of paupers being brought through the town up to Rathas for burial, but I think they were possibly from the auxiliary workhouses that were, more surrounded by streets, and they couldn't be buried. So I just see a question there, somebody asking who are the Boards of Guardians. They're the people they're the board that run the workhouse. I mean, it's like you have your executive officers like the master of the workhouse, the matron, and so on and so forth. But the board are the ones that direct they're the ones who allow, admit the paupers into the workhouse. They keep charge of the budget and so on and so forth. So just to recap here, the census tells us that 2,971 died between 1844 and 1851 in the workhouse. Thomas Hurley, one of the guardians, tells us that 1,876 people from the workhouse were buried within the enclosure between September 1850 and March 1853. Now, obviously, there's an overlap here that needs to be adjusted for. But I mean, I'm just being very cautious with these numbers because this is so not an exact science. I mean, the census figure itself is likely an underestimate. Hurley either forgot or glided over the fact that they'd started burials in the enclosure a full year before September 1850, that is in August 1859. So allowing for an overlap between August 1849 and March 1851, which is a period of 84 weeks approximately, and allowing for a weekly average of 10 deaths per week, which is probably a lower estimate. This gives us an overlap figure of 840 that must be subtracted from the total. So you have your 2,971, your 1,876, giving us a total of 4,847. You take away the possible overlap figure of 840, and you get a figure of 4,007 people who died in the workhouse and are buried in these two sites, at the back of Kerry County Council and within the enclosure beside Rathas Churchyard. Now, I just, as I say, extreme caution with seeing these numbers as a definitive number, because they could either, as they say, go up or down. But it is some sort of level of indication of, what kind of numbers we're talking about. Now, at this stage, you're probably scratching your head like I was, going, how could you possibly bury that many people into an area this size? I mean, the ground at the back of the workhouse is 0.286 acres. And within the enclosure itself, the guardians described the ground that they got there as a few perches, which is quite small. Now, I think the few perches may well have extended as the bodies pile up, but we're still really not talking about a very large area. And it's here that we turn to archaeology rather than the historical record or the documentary record to explain this, because there's been a number of archaeological excavations of workhouse burial grounds in recent years that have shed a lot of light about how you can bury a large mass of people in one small site. Now, perhaps the best example of this and the most relevant to our story here is the burial ground in the workhouse in Kilkenny, which was discovered in 2005 and excavated in 2006. Now, the Kilkenny workhouse was slightly larger than Tralee, but it had quite a similar history. In the 1920s, it became a hospital. The 1940s, the County Council machinery yard. and depot, and the burial ground within Kilkenny Workhouse, within its walls, had been in use from October 1847 to March 1851, so very, very similar. In 2006, archaeological excavation of the site there revealed the skeletal remains of at least 970 individuals in an area measuring 35 meters by 13 meters. So that's 455 square meters. By comparison, if you convert the acreage in the back of Tralee Workhouse, the site there is 1,157 square meters. So you could get the same number, i.e. 970, and a good bit more into this site alone. And while the Guardian spoke about just having a few perches, as I said, that may well have extended. And in any case, it depends how they defined a few. And just worth bearing in mind that one perch is equal to 25 square meters if you're good at doing sums in your head. So the Kilkenny remains were found in, where they were discovered in a series of pits. 63 pits in all. The pits were about 5 feet, well, I go metric here, I think they were about 1.5 meters wide and almost 2 meters long so almost 2 meters long. So the maximum depth of the pits was about 1.2 meters. They were dug down into the natural subsoil to an underlying level of free draining gravel. And the burial ground extended beyond the limit of the excavation, and the archaeologists estimated that there were still a further 8 to 11 pits on this site, that they didn't get to excavate. And the pits were close together with just about 30 to 80 centimeters between them. And the numbers of individuals in the pits varied between 6 and 27, with an average in each pit of 16. And the majority of pits contained between 14 and 22. So each pit, they reckoned, probably represents about 1 week's worth of deaths. Both adults and children were buried in each pit, and there was no separation of male and female. And in a few of the burials, some of the graves held 2 sets of remains, an adult and a child, as you'll see here, the child at the adult's knee. So similar pit burials have been discovered in Borris O'Kane in County Tipperary, and I think, it's highly probable that this is how the people were buried in the workhouse in Tralee also. So you can go down to about 2 meters before hitting bedrock in and around the workhouse, which means that you could pack a fair number of people into similar type of pits here. And so there's corroborating evidence from the poor law inspector in Tralee in 1851, Samuel Horsley, when he described the dead in the workhouse as being buried in tiers and not more than 6 inches in the ground, which suggests to me that the tiers have now pretty much reached the surface. So now, uncoffined burial was a feature of the famine. We all know this, but the evidence from the Kilkenny site shows that all the remains were interred in coffins, and similar evidence was found in workhouse excavations in Banbridge, County Down, and in Newry. In Kilkenny, there were soil stains in a clear hexagonal shape around the skeletons, and the remains were outlined by coffin nails. Now, the coffins were a very simple construction and there was wood fragments identified exclusively as pine. But they were in 3 standard sizes for adults, children, and for infants. Now, we often hear about the sliding coffin with a hatch that could slide the corpse into the grave and could be used and reused. But in the workhouse context, that doesn't seem to have happened. And I think it's unlikely to have happened as well in Tralee Workhouse, because Tralee Workhouse, like all the other workhouses around the country, tendered, they tendered for everything, but they tendered every year for coffins. You'll see down there underlined in red. They're advertising for 3 coffins as well, just for adults, children and infants dearly. And furthermore, in February 1847, the parish warden in Dingle wrote to the Tralee Board of Guardians that at this stage, Dingle Workhouse hadn't opened, that he had over 100 people begging him to send them to the workhouse in Tralee. He wrote, "They say they're satisfied to die after going there, as they are sure of getting something to eat while life remains and of being buried in coffins. The people are dying so very fast here, and they're being buried without coffins." So while the likelihood is there were coffins, they were of pretty poor quality. In July 1851, the Kerry Evening Post was complaining of the very inferior description of coffins supplied to Tralee Workhouse, and describes them as being so weak that they actually bend down in the middle. In the same month, one of the guardians described the coffins as having had not so much as a plane rubbed to the boards, though the contractor was very importunate for his salary. In Kilkenny, the coffins in the mass burials were stacked on top of each other in varying numbers of levels, depending on the depth of the pits. Similar to the Lusitania burials, in the burials of victims of the Lusitania drowning, or sinking, sorry, in 1915, that's in the black and white images there. And the mass burials in Hart Island in New York. Now, some of you may remember seeing pictures that flashed around the world last April on TV of mass burials of COVID-19 victims in New York. And Hart Island is the island off the city of New York that is for the unclaimed dead of New York. Now, as from what I understand, the unclaimed, you have to claim your dead within 48 hours there, or something quite short like that. So quite often people who, given the nature, the dispersed nature of families in America, people who quite often wouldn't get to claim their dead, you know, as soon as 48 hours. So there's, you know, people who have families that are buried there. It's a very interesting site. And if you look it up online, it's very, very interesting. But you can see how they're doing it there. And now, obviously in Hart Island, you have a machine to excavate a big pit like this. But you can see in 1915, that's a fairly big old pit there as well. So, and in Kilkenny, in the pits in Kilkenny, it was, the archaeologists found that it's clear to them that as many coffins as possible were squeezed in, with, you know, even a coffin being slotted in on its side between the side of the pit and a previously placed coffin. And then the pits were covered with the backfill soil, and there was also evidence of lime and sulfur in the backfill. So I think that's very likely what happened at the back of the workhouse and within the enclosure in Rathas. Now, God's Acre, as I say, opened in Ballybeggan for burials in October 1853. Now, at that stage, the death rates in the workhouse would have gone down. So I think it's unlikely that they were still resorting to pit burials there. At least I hope to God they were. But I mean, God's Acre really deserves its own careful study. And I mean, you know, it would be a very useful exercise to look at the workhouse minutes that run in a continuous run from post 1853 to see if they ever reverted back to recording the names of the dead who might be buried there. Now, moving on, you know, from the from 1856 onwards, you know, a series of burial acts saw graveyards all over Ireland being improved, and Rathas expanded as the town grew. And you'll see it starts expanding. That's the yellow bit there where its expansion is. It expands towards the town, and I think it's notable that it expands that way. And I think that the direction of the expansion acknowledges existing visible formal burials, you know, ones that were marked. These were, as I say, the people who could afford to pay for their graves during the famine. The unmarked graves of the poor on the workhouse side began to fade from memory. But that's not true of the burial ground at the back of the workhouse. This is it here. This is the burial ground at the back of Kerry County Council now. Now, I think it's very possible that in the 19th century, this is after the famine, that neonates and infants who died in the workhouse, I mean, I think unmarried mothers, they ended up, if they had nowhere else to go in the 19th century, ended up in the workhouse. Infant mortality being very high if they died. I wonder whether they were brought up to Ballybeggan or whether they were buried out the back. I think that's there's a strong possibility of that. We know that when the workhouse, excuse me, eventually became St. Catherine's in the 20th century, there were neonatal burials here from the 1930s right up into the 1980s. So this makes this site very complex and a very sensitive historic site. Now, that aspect of the 20th century aspect of the burial ground here is beyond the subject of my, or beyond the scope of my talk tonight, but it is, I think, a subject that requires its own very careful study, a careful analysis really of the ground that separates fact from conjecture and myth. But I will touch on it here to this extent because the dead babies that are buried here, they share not only a physical location with the paupers from the workhouse, but really also a liminal space. Sorry, that's gone on too far there. I mean, we're talking here about babies that who died before they received baptism because of miscarriage, because of stillbirth, or they died of natural causes before they were baptized. And in Christendom, in Western Christendom, baptism is recognized as the means whereby a new human being is accepted into the human Christian family. And for centuries, Catholic teaching cast the unbaptized into limbo. So the unbaptized child wasn't part of life or death, but existed in some sort of liminal space on the margins and couldn't be buried in consecrated ground, but had to be separated out from the rest of the community. And this too is what happened with 19th century paupers, because the introduction of the poor laws brought with it an ethos that regarded poverty as a sin, a moral failing. It was your fault. Paupers were those who'd failed to contribute to society and must be separated out from the world by means of the workhouse. And that separation continued in death as well, when their very burial places were supposed to be set apart from the rest of the communities, ensuring that paupers were effectively extinguished from society. And even when the dead of the workhouse were brought into it, even when they came out, let's say, from behind the back of the workhouse and were buried within the enclosure, they were kept apart from the town side of the enclosure and buried alongside the poor of the town, and eventually they were extinguished because, you know, that part of the graveyard is now built over. So paupers were considered invisible people, and their burial places weren't significant places for the rest of what we might call a normal community. And even though they might have been given coffins, the nature of the burials really still lacked full dignity. Their graves were unmarked and their names were unrecorded. And naming, as I say, marks the entry not only into biological, but also into human life. And having a baptismal name meant having a body that required care. So becoming a person is getting a name. The moment of naming has in many cases been the divide between counting as a human being and not. And so here in this burial ground, we have the nameless dead. And as is a cultural historian Thomas Lacour has written, to die in name as in body, as well as in body, to become nameless, to lose that by which the dead were known among the living, is a profound and deep kind of death, mortality in flesh and memory. But while we might not be able to recover their names, we can bring their memory back into the public consciousness as part of an active graveyard. There's great scope now to open access into the wider Rathas burial ground. You see the blue arrow here, it's now growing almost to a point where the two burial grounds can meet. So making a doorway or a gate from the old workhouse burial ground into Rathas and making a path, making a path there, I think would be a profound symbol of integration, bringing the marginalized out of their liminal space into the wider community and recognizing our shared humanity. And this is a plan that we've been working on in Kerry County Council for the past 2 years or so now. Obviously, like everything in life, it's been derailed by the COVID crisis, but it will get back on track. And I think it's important to remember as well that the site remains intact. Its boundary has never been breached, despite the change of use of the campus over its history from workhouse to hospital to County Council headquarters. And ultimately, it's the intention of Kerry County Council to contextualise the history of the site in a way that promotes access, inclusion and reflection. And there is a complete acceptance that from a historical and an ethical standpoint, it's appropriate and absolutely correct and about time that the dead who are buried in this site are remembered and not hidden away, as is currently the case.